Hi, welcome to Rooting DC 2022 and your talk on growing great tomatoes for the Mid-Atlantic and specifically Washington, DC and its suburbs. I'm Kathy Jentz. I am the editor of Washington Gardener magazine, all about gardening and growing in the greater Washington, DC area. I also host the Garden DC podcast, and I am the co-author of a new book on urban gardening called The Urban Garden: 101 Ways to Grow Food and Beauty in the City. So welcome, and feel free to pop questions in the chat as this talk goes, and we'll try to field them live. And if we don't get to your questions, we will respond to your questions afterwards. And you can just put them up either on the YouTube channel, or you can find me on social media at WDC Gardener and ask your follow-up tomato questions on any of those platforms. And I'm happy to get back to you, and I'll share some of my social media links and information at the end of this slideshow. So welcome. So it's the beginning of summer here in Washington, DC. First day of summer is just around the corner, and we are obsessed, I think, in this region, especially with growing great tomatoes, especially for flavor, but also, you know, for bragging rights. And some of you might even be doing it for a living. So I know some of you are urban farmers and want to grow the best tomatoes possible to sell at your farm market, or to be growing for food programs for the hungry and other things. So we want to get that best yield, right? The most amount of tomatoes, but also the best tasting tomatoes and the most nutritious. So let's jump into some tomato growing basics to start. And so our first thing we want to do, especially if we're growing in an urban location, is get a soil test done of the soil. So if you're in containers, we'll talk about that separately in a minute, you can completely control the soil mix. But if you're planting into the ground, you want to get that soil test, especially so you know if you have any heavy metal issues. And heavy metals means lead, cadmium, that sort of thing that can contaminate your food crops. So you're going to go get a soil test kit online or from a local nursery. If you are in Virginia and watching this, you can get it at your local library and send it into Virginia Tech. So you'll send your soil test in after gathering a soil sample, and they'll give you the results. And you want to especially mark when you're sending that soil test in to the laboratory that this is for a food garden, because most of the soil tests sent in are for like turf grass, play fields, soccer fields, that sort of thing. So they're going to optimize the results for turf grass. You want them to optimize the results and read it for your food garden to make sure of that. So our next thing we want to do is, if you can, purchase, maybe as a group purchase, if you're in a community garden, a soil thermometer. And soil thermometer is also sold as a mulch thermometer. So it basically looks like that big turkey thermometer that you get at the food store, except for it has a long needle end to it, like 2.5 to 3 feet long, that you would stick in the middle of your mulch pile and get a thermometer reading. This you want for your soil. So why do you want to know your soil temperatures? We're going to go into that heavily in a minute, but soil temperatures and tomato growing go hand in hand, are the most important thing to know when starting out your tomato seedlings. If you don't have access to a thermometer or a shared one, you can always use one of the many websites for local farmers, and you can just Google soil temperature reading, and then your zip code or Washington, DC, or your county and your local soil temperature should be available. Sometimes they'll show it like on some of the weather websites, but not always. So soil temperature is completely different than air temperature. So it could be an 80-degree day in May, but your soil could still be below 50. So you need to know your soil temperature, because the roots of the tomato plants will not expand into the surrounding soil until it is at least 65 degrees, preferably 68. I would say wait even longer. So most people plant their tomatoes far too early. And what happens to the little seedlings when you put them in that hole surrounded by cold soil is that they just sit, and the roots can get damaged. They can even get frosted or freeze damage by sitting in cold soil, but they won't expand into that soil until it's warm enough for them. So they just sit and sit and sit. And then the person who plants their tomato correctly at the end of May, beginning of June, will plant it into the nice warmed up soil. The roots will immediately start to expand and be nice and healthy and grab onto that local soil around it and then start to grow. So you're basically stunting your plants, just kind of exposing them to an unnecessary harm by planting them too early, and getting them off to not the healthiest start. So you want to get that soil temperature reading and know that it's nice and warm for them to expand their roots into and get a healthy start on there. And then next, if you don't have great soil, if you do have heavy metals, if you don't have the growing space in the ground, you can use raised beds. You can also do Earthbox type containers, and you can also do a huge round container. So the Earthbox are those like square or rectangular type containers with a wicking system for moisture. But you can also have your own drip irrigation system that you make, or you can hand water. And we'll talk about proper watering of tomatoes in a second as well. And if you're going to use just regular old planting pot, I recommend at least a 24-inch diameter for each tomato plant. So if you have one 24-inch diameter huge pot, you're going to put the tomato directly in the middle, put it in there with its stake or some type of support, and that will be its pot. And then the next one would have its own 24-inch pot, and so on. If you were lucky enough to have like a huge grow pot that was like 6 feet in diameter, then you could put multiple tomatoes in that pot. But tomato roots are very greedy, and if you've ever pulled a tomato plant up at the end of the season and got all those roots, you'll see that they go way far out from that original little plant. You know, it's not just a 3-inch circle, it's usually about 5 to 6 feet. So you want to get that roots as much room as possible. And then finally, for tomato growing, you're going to need full sun. So I hate to break it to everybody who doesn't have full sun access. Full sun means 6 to 8 hours in order to have some fruit production. You might have sporadic flowering and a couple small fruits in part sun, but you're not going to get that full prolific fruit production without 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight. Okay, so let's go on to some planting tips. So bury deep up the stem. So what do I mean by that? Okay, I'm going to use a pen to show. So this is your tomato seedling. I'll hold it up to my face. These are some of the leaves here. This is where it's in the pot down here. So between the first set of leaves and where it's in the pot, I am going to plant the plant all the way up here directly under that first set of leaves. I might even take off those first set of leaves and plant it up to the second set of leaves. So all of this real estate, all of this stem is going to be below the ground level. And that's what they mean by plant your tomatoes deep, because everywhere that the stem is down below the root level, it will form roots. So all of these side nodes will form roots and make a more stable and healthy plant that will get more energy up into fruit production. So don't worry that you have like this kind of scraggly, tall little seedling. You're going to bury most of it. So the next note I have here is on-site in a trench. So some people like to plant their tomatoes kind of this direction. So on its side, they'll dig a 4-inch trench that's 4 inches deep, maybe a foot long, lay the tomato plant. So here would be the root mass, here's the stem, and then just the tip with just the little bit of greenery here sticking out. So again, everything is below the soil level. And that would be if you had some of a more shallow, maybe container for planting your tomato and you didn't have in ground where you can go deep. So you might do the side with just a little bit of it bent up and above the surface to do that. And then my other recommendation, of course, is to always put the plant supports in at the same time as you are putting your little seedling plants. Because what happens if you come back a month later, your plant is starting to grow up, it's getting floppy, it's going all over the place. You come and you stab the plant supports in the ground, you're stabbing through the great roots. And of course, we want to talk about healthy roots make healthy plants. So we don't want to damage the root system later on. So we're going to put that main stake right in the back. And I'm putting arrows here to show you. So I'm putting the label and the stake right in the back of the plant. So I know this is this variety, and the stake is going right along the seedling, not through its roots. So I like to use these tall coated rebar. So they're about 3 feet tall. You can get 5 feet, 6 feet taller. I like these better than the traditional kind of tornado shaped tomato cages that they sell, the galvanized steel ones, because those are top heavy, as we've all experienced. When it's top heavy, it's more likely to fall over in a windstorm or a thunderstorm. So if I do use a cage method, so I have some cages that are more hexagonal or horizontal that are wider at the bottom. So look for tomato cages that either, if they're round, they're wider at the bottom, or if they're square, they're wider at the bottom for more stability. And or you can just do one straight stake and then start attaching the tomato to that as it grows up. And another method I'm seeing become really popular now is to make a large rack, like a ladder rack or cage, and then strings for each of the tomatoes to go up. So there would be like kind of like a pergola over the tomatoes, and then strings coming down at each tomato for the tomatoes to go up. And why is that a great method and becoming more and more popular? Because tomatoes are a vine. Yay. So you learned something new today. Tomatoes are a vining fruit. Some of them are indeterminate and some are determinate. So those big vocabulary words. Determinate means I stop growing at a certain determined place that my genetics tell me to stop. And that's usually plum tomatoes or bush tomatoes. So they'll stop at about 2 to 3 feet maybe. So those are determinate tomatoes. They might not need caging at all. They might not even need staking. They're a nice full bushy plant, but you might want to still cage them to keep your fruit off the ground and to keep good air circulation around them. And we'll talk more about that in a second and why that's important. So the other kind, and the majority of tomatoes that you're going to grow, are indeterminate, meaning they never have a point where they stop growing. So they'll just keep going and going and going. There are actually varieties of little cherry tomatoes that will go on to 30 and 40 feet. And I had trialed one year that showed you can go out your 3rd floor window and pick tomatoes from it. It didn't get quite that tall for me by the end of the growing season. It got about 15 feet tall. I strung it up my gutter system. But I think if we had had a longer summer, I would have got to that height. So that's a fun one to experiment with. All right, so our next question I often get for tomato growing is pruning. So you don't have to do any pruning and you'll still get tons of fruit. So this is just to maximize more fruit. So do you need to remove the suckers? For determinate varieties, you can let them be. So determinate, again, are the shorter, bushier types that don't keep growing and growing. For the indeterminate or vining types, you can prune out the little suckers to increase the air circulation and control the plant size. So you can pinch back the growing tip at the top, and you can pinch back the suckers that are kind of come, and I'm going to try to show you on an arrow. So a sucker might be a little growth that comes out here as a side branch, and you can also pinch out some of those little extra side branches there. And guess what? You can make new tomato plants if you want to from those suckers. So if you have like a little Dixie cup full of moist soil, you could immediately take those little suckers you pruned out and stick them into the moist soil. And a lot of them will take root, and then you can plant those out. So you can have more little tomato babies. That's always a fun experiment. I would say about 50% of them will take root and succeed for you when you pinch out some of the suckers and do it that way. So I was going to go back and say, why do we want to increase air circulation, which I referred to earlier? And we're going to talk about disease and pest issues in a couple of slides. So next, I'm not paid by either of these brands, Espoma or Alaska. These are just the couple that I use, and I get asked which ones I use all the time. So I'm just showing you a quick picture of them. So tomatoes are known as heavy feeders, which means they need a lot of extra nutrition. So I use Espoma TomatoTone, which comes in a bag, and it's a granular fertilizer, and I sprinkle that around the base of the tomatoes, kind of scratch it in so that it goes down to the roots. And that's just one application a few weeks after I plant the tomatoes. And then about a month after we plant the tomatoes, we will start watering using a cap full of the fish emulsion or fish fertilizer in the water when you're watering your tomatoes. So that is giving you calcium to stop blossom end rot. That's giving you some of the great nitrogen and nutrition. So you see it's 5-1-1. It's not a high phosphate fertilizer, but it's giving it good steady nutrition throughout the summer. So a note about fertilizing: we don't fertilize plants when we first put them in the ground. You want to wait a few weeks. And my analogy for that is always, if you were at sea and all of a sudden fell into the water. So that would be similar to, you took this little seedling out of its little seed pack, out of its little cell pack that you bought it, or if you were growing them inside and you took them out of that climate condition and then all of a sudden shoved them into the soil. That would be similar to you being on a boat and then thrown into the ocean. You're like, I don't know what to do. I can't get my sea legs. I don't know how to swim. And then you fell into the ocean and I threw you a bottle of vitamins and I said, there you go. Instead of helping you learn to swim. And so you're going to let the plant get acclimated to the surrounding soil, get its sea legs, expand its roots, let it learn to swim. Then after a couple weeks, you're going to give it some extra fertilizers to gain strength and momentum so it can grow at that point. So it's not doing it any good when you're giving it fertilizer upon planting. You want to wait a few weeks and then it can absorb it, then it could take it in, then it can handle it. So you can even harm plants by giving them fertilizer immediately after planting them, because that's when you get some yellowing of the leaves right away. It's too much for them to handle, and sometimes you can burn some of the foliage by doing that. All right, so big thing in tomato maintenance is watering tips. So we want to water daily for the first 2 weeks that the seedling is in the ground. And that is only if it doesn't rain. So if it rains that day and we get, a good quarter to a half inch, don't also water on top of that. So if it doesn't rain that day, water it. And then after that, you're going to water as needed. Most tomato plants, once established, need about 1 inch per week. So you're going to keep up with the local weather and what it says as far as rainfall. And if you get a half inch in that week, give it another half inch. If you get an inch or plus, you don't need to water your tomato plants. So you just keep up and know what amount of rainfall is in your area. And then you're going to water the roots, not the leaves. So this lady is a no-no right here. So she's watering overhead. She's dousing the plants and introducing moisture onto the leaves, which causes disease and pest issues in tomatoes in our area. So we want to, as much as possible, water just the base around the roots. And we also want to not have it splash back onto the leaves. So it's a good idea to mulch around the stem. And I'm going to go back a couple slides to show that. So we've just got a few pieces of straw. We're just starting to put the mulch around the base of the tomato. So we're just kind of demo that. You were going to put a lot more straw than that. That was just to show the start of putting straw around the base of that. The straw is going to help hold in moisture into the soil. It's going to help on super hot days to keep the plant roots cool. It's going to cut down on weeding, and that's a great reason to mulch. The other great reason to mulch around tomato plants in particular is that the spores of the fungal diseases like early blight and late blight live in the soil, and when water or rain comes down, it splashes onto the soil and splashes those spores back onto the leaves. If you have a base of straw or other type of mulch, then you can keep some of that splash back down. So that's always a good thing to do. And I personally use straw in my community garden plot. You can use other forms of mulch. Some people will use that black plastic. Some people will use just regular wood chips. So whatever material you have available for mulching is great. Okay, so a few harvesting tips. So what happens a lot in the DC area is, of course, it gets hot and very humid by mid-July and August, right when our tomatoes are starting to ripen. And I do see a lot of people at my community garden abandoning their plots at that point. They've gone to the beach, they've given up, they have no more energy, they're tired of their plot at that point. Well, that's the point where you're getting the investment that you put in great soil and preparation and great roots. Now you want to be coming to your plot at least every 2 to 3 days to pick. So you want to harvest when they're starting to ripen. You can harvest right when they're starting to get that red blush and bring them inside to ripen. Everybody has their favorite ways of home ripening. Don't put them in the refrigerator. They will stop ripening at that point. You can place them on a countertop. You can place them in a sunny window. Some people put them in a brown paper bag. Whatever your favorite method for getting them to ripen inside is great. And why I'm telling you to get them when they're first starting to ripen, say it's a red tomato and it's got pink and it's starting to go darker red, is the point I would pick it, is to get ahead of pests like rodents and squirrels and birds. And also so you can have access to them and before they get overripe on the vine and drop to the ground. So you want to have really good hygiene in the garden. Any dropped fruit will attract rodents. So you want to make sure nothing is falling to the ground. It's all clear underneath. And you can even snip off some of those lower or pinch off some of those lower leaves to get nice air circulation and so you can see underneath your plants. You're going to store your tomatoes at room temperature, not in the refrigerator, as I said. If you have a huge excess harvest, yay, that's great. Give some to your local food kitchen, food bank or soup kitchen. You can can or freeze your excess. Do that while they are still ripe and at their peak. And this is my savory tomato jam recipe, which I'm happy to share with anybody if you'd like that recipe. So it's got a little bit of pepper, a little kick to it, and a tiny bit of sweetness. So but it's basically a savory tomato jam recipe. All right, so we're going to do a little bit of troubleshooting next, and then we're going to get to the fun part of the talk, which is my favorite tomatoes and recommendations for the greater Washington, D.C. area. So the first that thing that usually happens in tomatoes about, early July into July is it's starting to form, and then it forms these cracks or catfacing, sometimes it's called. So there's not much you can do about this, but no, it's unsightly, but it doesn't damage the fruit as far as eating. So I would come and pick this gorgeous orange, German orange tomato, and just cut out the crack, discard that in my compost pile, and eat the rest. So the rest of the tomato is perfectly edible. Same thing with this cracking here on this cherry tomato. I would just cut out this little section here and eat the rest. Totally edible. Don't throw out the whole tomato fruit just because it has a little cracking or catfacing. So most of this is because of uneven moisture. So what happens is we have a day of heavy rain and then 3 days of no rain and hot heat, and then a deluge of like 3 to 4 inches in one day, and that expands the fruit skin and then cracks it really quickly and then can contract it. So that's what's happening with the cracking or cat facing. This is common in a lot of fruits, not just tomatoes. You'll see it in especially cherries. This happens a lot. So it's upsetting to growers. Again, it doesn't hurt the fruit. It doesn't, it's not bad for it. It's not a disease. It's still all edible. It's just not as pretty, right? And you can try to even this out by drip irrigation, by steady watering. But if Mother Nature sends a huge storm, what control do you have over that? Probably not a lot, unless you're in a grow tunnel or you have something else blocking the rain from coming over your plants. All right, so our next is blossom end rot, and this one is really not pretty. So it basically, the bottom of the fruit from where it's growing has this big brown bruise on it, and that usually is due to calcium deficiency. So again, you can still eat these peach tomatoes, so you can still cut that section off and eat the rest. Again, it's not a disease. It's not going to spread to the rest of the fruit. It's just going to form that big blotchy brown bruise type of thing. And you can eat the total rest of it with no problem and just discard or compost what you cut off there. And to prevent it, you want to make sure you have enough calcium in the soil. So I smash up eggshells from when I'm baking. I put the eggshell into the microwave for 1 minute, zap it for a minute to get rid of any E. coli or salmonella or any other issues. Then I collect those eggshells over the winter and smash them into little bits and put them in the planting holes with the tomatoes and top dress the surface of the soil with that calcium so it's available to them. The tomato fertilizer I showed you earlier will also help you with the calcium, and so will the fish fertilizer. And also getting the soil test and determining if there is enough calcium in your soil to start off with will help as well. So if you have continual blossom end rot year after year, you might look at amending your soil with some calcium and other materials. So that could be in the form of crushed oyster shells or other materials that will add calcium. Bone meal is a good supplement as well to add calcium to your soil. I always say bone meal last because dogs are attracted and other animals are attracted to bone meal. So I would use that inside the planting hole or double dig it into your soil rather than just dust it on the surface around your tomatoes. All right, so this is an unusual problem in tomatoes that we don't normally have. It's more of a problem in like the sunny Southwest states, but Sunscald every once in a while will happen and somebody would be like, how come my tomato has white shoulders? I have this great ripening tomato, right? And then it has this white area. What's wrong with it? So again, totally edible. You can still eat it. Your tomato just has the tomato equivalent of sunburn. So what's happening is the whole top of the plant has defoliated because of maybe a late blight disease or other fungal disease. So all the leaves that were kind of half shading it have gone and are exposing the fruits to the full beating down summer sun. And so you get this sun scald, it's called. So there is a way to prevent it. And in some places, you'll even see little pop-up tents or, these little muslin tents, or you'll even see little mini umbrellas that people will put over their fruit trees and plants to prevent sun scald, because it's not just a problem of tomatoes, but other fruits as well. I don't think we need to go to that extent. If your tomato plant defoliates, but you still have fruit and flowers on it, it will still form the fruits. They'll still be edible and everything. You could throw a remay or cover cloth over it to prevent the sun scald. But again, still totally edible, just not as pretty as a big red juicy tomato usually looks. Okay, so this is a huge one that a lot of people haven't heard of. in prevention, which is tobacco mosaic virus. And this photo shows you what it looks like on a big tobacco leaf. So it'll look similar on a tomato leaf. You'll start to see this white stippling under it. So this kind of actually looks kind of like a cool variegation, right? That's not how a tobacco leaf is supposed to look. It's supposed to be dark, healthy green. So this is transmitted from the tobacco family to anything in the nightshade or tomato family. So this can be transmitted to your potatoes, your tomatoes, your eggplants, peppers as well. And what usually happens is somebody handles tobacco materials and then touches their tomato plant. So if you're a smoker, whether you get cigarettes, cigars, marijuana, anything tobacco related that would have tobacco in it, make sure you wear gloves before you handle those nightshade plants. Even if you scrubbed, I think you're still going to have, you know how a lot of smokers have yellow nails from the tobacco in there. You could still expose it. Never smoke around your vegetable garden or your plants, or allow people to smoke in that vicinity, because dropped cigarette butts and those sort of things can also transfer tobacco mosaic virus to your plants. So that's a super easy preventable virus, and I just wanted to get the word out there for everybody. Okay, so now the big family of what usually we're plagued with in this area, because we have a lot of heat and humidity, are wilts, blights, and fungal diseases. So this is an example of early blight. So what usually happens is early blight is in the soil. Like I said, the microbes are in the soil, and it can come from the person that you bought the started plant from. So it's already in there. Early blight is in the soil. Then it rains, the rain splashes that up onto the plants. And even though they have this black plastic material and a nice row of straw around there, it's still gotten to that lower foliage. So what you want to do is clean out anything yellow, spotted, brown foliage. You want to just pinch that out as soon as you see that before it spreads up to the upper leaves. And don't compost any dead, diseased, or damaged leaves from fungal wilts or blights. You want to put those in a trash bag and send those out to the landfill, because if you compost them, the microbes are back in your compost and will be reintroduced back into your garden. So you want to keep really good hygiene, keep any dropped damaged leaves out of your tomato zone. And then this is usually when people will ask me about planting in your different parts of your vegetable garden to get away from it. So if last year you had early blight or late blight or another disease, I would put your tomato in another part of your plot if you are able, but rotation crops, it usually should be 1 acre apart. And that's not really realistic, right? For a lot of us in community gardens or a small backyard or urban garden. So you can try to put it from the furthest point. So if I have my tomatoes in my back right corner last year, I will put my tomatoes in my front left corner this year. So the farthest parts of my plot apart I can do, I will do, but that's as good as you can probably do. If you are growing in containers and you had a fungal disease or something in that soil last year, then I want you to get rid of that container soil from last year, throw that out, get new, fresh, healthy soil in your containers, and sanitize the containers with the 10% bleach solution. And 10% bleach solution is 9 parts water, 1 part bleach. Wipe out your container inside and out. Wipe off your tools, wipe off those plant stakes that you used from last year. So see these plant stakes, anything I used last year on my tomatoes, I'm going to wipe off and sanitize if I had a disease last year, so I don't carry it over for this year. And that includes your garden gloves. Throw those in the wash every once in a while if they're washable. Okay, so pests. We're going to talk a little bit about not putting bone meal to attract pests, but you know, every once in a while, pests like the same things that we like to eat, except for most mammals do not like members of the nightshade family. Again, eggplants and tomatoes, that family. Most mammals shy away from that. They won't eat the foliage. They don't want the fruit. But what a squirrel is doing here, and this is one of our biggest pests on our tomatoes in our area, is they are scraping out the moisture. You'll notice they're not eating the whole tomato. If they love tomatoes, they would just chow down and eat the whole thing. What they do is they come and they scrape out the moisture and then leave the hull, right, and just leave it on the ground. Or same thing with birds, they'll come and peck a hole and suck out some of that moisture. What they're doing is they're desperate in July and August for water sources. So if you can give the local wildlife a water source somewhere nearby, but not in your vegetable plot, running water, running clean water, you know, or having a bird bath that you wash out and refill every day helps a lot, because all creatures want fresh, clean water. They will leave your tomatoes alone. The squirrels and birds will go for that fresh, clean water, especially if it has a burbler or a running little fountain in it, much more than they will go for your tomatoes. So that's my biggest advice. And also giving them other things to eat elsewhere. So with rabbits, give them a little patch of clover elsewhere. They love the clover. Give deer something else over there that they won't be tromping into your vegetable bed. And the next thing, best thing to do is some type of exclusion cage using a hardware cloth or chicken wire around your plants that you want to protect is your next step in protecting against pests. Okay, so with Washington Gardener Magazine, we host an annual tomato taste at the Silver Spring Farmers Market, usually end of August, early September, and we source from the local farmers and ask them to enter their best tomatoes. And so we usually have 10 or 12 tomatoes every year. It won't be the same 10 or 12. Like this year, we would have had green Cherokee, green zebra, black Cherokee, some German orange or German peach. And then next year we might have some other varieties. But every year we keep track and we have people come through and taste and vote. We usually have about 300 plus people coming through and voting in just a short 2-hour period. And so I've kept track of all those over the years, and also what we've grown in our own experimental garden and what I've talked to local farmers and growers about their best varieties. And that's how I've come up with our list of our top 12. So yay, the fun part. So the best for canning is the Roma Plum. It's also usually labeled San Marzano or Amish paste. So you'll see either of those names on the seed packs or on the seedling tomato plants. And these are big fat plum varieties that don't have a ton of flesh inside. I mean, they have the thick walls, but they don't have a ton of the pulpiness inside. So they're really good paste tomatoes. They're prolific plants. And again, they're that determinate variety we talked about, bush tomato, where most of the tomatoes come into ripening about the same week or two. So you can pick them all and batch them all at once. So that's another big difference between determinate and indeterminate. Is determinate usually has one big flush of harvest and then maybe a few scattered after that, whereas determinate has a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time, a little bit of time all throughout the season. So that can be another decision maker between whether you grow determinate or indeterminate varieties of tomatoes. Okay, so our next is Cherokee Purple, which I just referred to earlier. So this is an heirloom variety that's super popular. It has a really good meaty tomato taste. It's like a salad-sized tomato. It doesn't get huge sandwich size, like sandwich slicing size, like some of the others I'll talk about here. But this one is a favorite among people who really like a strong tomato taste rather than a sweet taste. All right, so our next is Black Krim. So this one is a sandwich size one. So when I talk about sandwich size, I'm talking about something that you can slice and it's the size of your piece of bread. And versus a salad size, which is more like the size of a small apple or orange that you can cut into wedges and put into a salad. So Black Krim is a great one for sandwiches. It's super healthy, hardy in our area, and blight resistant. Okay, so Better Boy is from one of the Burpee family of tomatoes, and this one is gaining more and more in popularity because of its disease resistant, because of its uniform, big, classic red tomato. And this is more like between a salad and a sandwich sized tomato. And if you like just that classic look and a large amount of harvest, Better Boy is for you. And again, it's from Burpee and disease resistant. And Burpee does their trials up in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And they will usually, if you're on their customer list or you go to their website, they will let you know when that open house is. And that's really fun to go up and go see those Burpee trials in person. So you can see Better Boy against the other new boys and girls in their tomato trials and check them out in person for yourself. So it's a fun family outing in the summertime. Right, so next is Big Beef or Beefmaster. So just like the name says, it's a big beefy tomato, and this is again known as a sandwich slicer tomato. So if you love BLTs, this might be the one you grow. You're going to get fewer but bigger fruits on your plants. So if you want a lot of them, you want to grow multiple plants. So with the bigger tomatoes, you're just going to get, each tomato plant might have 5 to 10 fruits on it by the end of the season. So know that versus the cherry type tomatoes where you're going to get hundreds of tomatoes, small tomatoes on the cherry ones. All right, so Early Girl, very similar to Better Boy. I'm going to go back and show you that slide again. So there's Better Boy, and Early Girl, very similar in looks, same, I think, genetic stock, except for Early Girl was bred to be the earliest ripening tomato. And they usually promise something around between 4th of July and 15th of July for our area. So if you're really, really anxious for that first summer tomato, plant at least one Early Girl plant, and good taste, good uniform tomato. All right, so next is Rutgers. So this one was developed by Rutgers University, and this one is known for its really good disease resistance and a good all-around eating tomato for salads and sandwiches and snacking on. So this is sometimes you'll see Rutgers 100 and some numbers after it, but just usually Rutgers is fine. This is the one that I would recommend to beginners. So because of its disease resistance. And I would say if you've not grown a big tomato before, go with the Rutgers as a beginner one. Okay, so this is one of my favorites, and this is Matt's Wild Cherry. You'll also see this as a currant tomato, and currant spelled C-U-R-R-A-N-T. These are little tiny cherry tomatoes, and they are a little bit bigger than a BB. So I have them here in a container with Sungold. So this is your Sungold cherry tomatoes. And this is just showing you the comparison in size between that. And they are extremely prolific. They're related again to the wild currant tomatoes, which they're just crazy vining and prolific. You're not going to even be able to keep up with the eating, and they're so fun to just grab by the handful and just pop in your mouth right out in the garden, or just grab a handful and throw it on top of a salad or a pasta dish. They're so much fun, especially with kids for gardening. They're very sweet, very good. So they're more on the sweet side of things than the tomato side of things. And again, super prolific. One thing I'll warn you about, once you start growing the currant tomatoes, some of them, because you can't even keep track of all the harvest, will fall on the ground and they will reseed next year. So it is a wild tomato. So it usually will come true to seed, and you'll have that cherry tomato maybe every year if you don't weed out those baby tomato seedlings after that. Okay, so I included yellow pear because it always does well in our taste tests, and people just love snacking on the little yellow pear cherry tomatoes. Again, it's a very prolific plant, very disease resistant, and it's that sweet, nice tomatoey taste, really nice snacking tomato and for throwing on a salad. This is my absolute favorite, along with the Matt's Wild Cherry, the current tomatoes. Those are the two that I grow for myself every year. And this is Sun Gold, and then an improved version is Sun Sugar. And I don't need an improved version. I'll buy either Sun Gold or Sun Sugar. This is a very super sweet cherry tomato, very prolific. Your plants are usually covered in these little yellow golden tomatoes. And kids go crazy for them. It's like candy. In our annual tomato taste, Sun Sugar or Sun Gold, whichever ones we have entered every year, are usually first or second, almost always. So that tells you what a great popular tomato this is. And so if you haven't grown Sun Sugar, I would highly recommend it if you're into the sweet side of the tomato spectrum. All right, so next is Green Zebra. So this is a beautiful tomato. It has this like green streaking, this almost yellow streaking to it, and the flesh is green as well, and that's perfectly ripe. It's not a green tomato, which you can eat green tomatoes, but Green Zebra is actually ripe at this state. So I recommend this for people who have a lot of plant and tomato theft in their garden, because people don't think it's ripe and they pass it up for the red tomato. And it's got a really good tomatoey type taste. And how you know it's ripe is you feel the tomato itself, and you'll start to feel when it's heavy and full, and it kind of, you know, dimples when you kind of like push on it. So you'll get a feel for when it's ripe. When it's still kind of rock hard, don't pick it. But when it starts to get a little soft to the flesh, pick it and then let it ripen further inside for you. So this is a great one, again, for deterring pests and thieves, because they don't think it's ready for eating, but it's totally ready and it's beautiful. It's also fun to have Green Zebra and a couple of the red and maybe the yellow pear and mix it in a tomato salad. So you have the yellow, green, and red all together. And that's always fun to add into a pasta and something else for more color in your recipes. All right, so next, similar to the apple pear, is apple yellow. And this is one I trialed a couple years ago. It's All America Selections winner, and I recommend apple yellow because it's got a thick outer skin and flesh, and then basically it's hollow inside. It's almost like a little mini yellow sweet pepper. So you can take these, and I wish I had a better photo, and maybe I'll add it to my next slideshow when I do this talk again. You can cut these apple yellows in half and then just stuff them like with a little bit of cream cheese or other additive that you want, anything that you like to eat your tomatoes with. Of course, you can just eat them straight as snacks out of hand, but apple yellow is an extremely prolific grower and fruiting. I think I took maybe 100 tomatoes in mid-August off of just one plant, and I put them in a dryer. So I put them in a dryer for fruits to make fruit leather, and just dried them as sun-dried tomatoes because they had such a thick coating and such little pulp. I knew that they would do well at that. I sprinkled a little sea salt and seasoning on them, and they are fabulous as dried tomatoes. So if you're a big fan of drying your tomatoes to add to dishes later on in the season, I also recommend apple yellow for that, but also straight off the plant, eating them and as an appetizer. All right, so this is where I usually ask for any favorite tomato varieties that I have missed. So you can go ahead and throw those up in the chat, or let me know later on your favorites that I might have missed. And for further reading and sources about great growing of tomatoes in our area, you can check out our magazine, Washington Gardener. I recommend going on garden tours, talking to your neighbors. What tomatoes are they growing? What are they having success with? Especially if you're in a community garden, that's communal knowledge, right? That you can share. Like one person is doing great with yellow pear, one person's doing great with Roma, and then you can compare notes with each other as well. There's some great out of print local gardening books. One was published by the Washington Post back in the 60s and 70s. Is about the size of the old Sears catalog. And that was just called the Washington Post Garden Book, I believe. And you could still get that at tag sales and used bookstores for $1 or $2. There's one that has like a pink edge to the cover that looks like a Reader's Digest size book that was published by the Men's Club of Montgomery County. That you can always find in local bookstores, used bookstores for $1 or so. And that has great basic gardening knowledge. And the Washington Star newspaper also had its own gardening book back in the 60s and 70s that I usually come across at used book sales. Visit local public gardens. A lot of them have great demonstration edible gardens, like Green Spring Gardens in Annandale, Virginia is a great one to visit. U.S. Botanic Garden on the National Mall. The USDA has a People's Garden on the National Mall in front of their headquarters. So great to look at what's doing well there is going to do well for you at home as well. And then follow other local gardeners on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter and compare notes and talk to each other. I use the hashtag GardenDC, all one word, no spaces or dashes. So GardenDC to find other local gardeners, and then I'll amplify their posts and share them as well on social media. And then just want to give a plug for my new book, and you'll see some nice cherry tomatoes on that cover there, because we talk about both food techniques and ornamental plant techniques in the urban garden. And for further questions and to contact me, you can find me at washingtongardener.blogspot.com, on Twitter, Instagram, and Pinterest, and now TikTok as well. I'm at WDC Gardener. On Facebook, you can follow Washington Gardener Magazine, and we post a garden tip of the week. The podcast is weekly. It's called Garden DC, and that's new episodes go out on Saturdays. We've had 2 just tomato episodes. One was on heirloom tomatoes specifically. So check out that back episode. And another one was on tomato growing in general, all about tomato tips from Doug Oster, who's from Pittsburgh, PA. And he is a huge tomato grower. And you'll definitely want to hear some of his great tomato growing tips. So if you enjoyed today's talk, please give me a review on greatgardenspeakers.com or greatgardenspeakers.org. Would love to hear your feedback there. And that concludes our talk for today. And I just want to say thank you all for joining me. If you're watching this on a recording in the future, again, you can contact me through one of the social media outlets that I'm on for future questions. And I'm going to check for the live audience just to see if I have a couple more questions. And I think we're good. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy your gardening this summer. Send me some pictures or maybe post some pictures and tag me of all those great tomatoes you grow. And wait, I'm going to check the chat for a couple live questions. And I'll go back to the post on Great Garden Speakers. There we go. So I just had a request to show that slide again. And thank you all. Happy gardening.